A thin and sickly-looking man had been pounding on the plastic barrier at the check-in desk while we were in the waiting room, shouting what mostly sounded like a string of nonsense at the poor hospital employee behind it. I was reaching that weird twilight state where the sedatives make everything seem slightly surreal. The pictures in the magazine I was holding seemed to be moving, and I was pointing them out to my wife, Mary Ann, who suppressed a laugh in response. I was a bit out of it, but I do remember that he was screaming something along the lines of that he was very sick, and that something was in his body with him and they needed to get it out. As she led me out of the waiting room, my nurse cheerfully explained the procedure to me while wearing the brightest smiley face scrubs I'd ever seen. I shot one look back to Mary Ann because, despite the waiting room being nearly empty, the yelling guy had sat down right next to her and stared at her while he kept rubbing at his eyes. She grinned at me, gave me her "I'll be fine" look, waved me on, and pulled out a well-worn paperback. Once we got past the door, there was a young woman in a hospital bed, being taken down the same hallway as me. She smiled at me serenely, but there was something weird about her that I couldn't put my finger on. Maybe the way she stared at me without blinking, or how she breathed in strange, exaggerated breaths. It was almost as if she was trying to demonstrate to those around her that she was truly an authentic, living, breathing person. She stared at me with what looked to be curling, delicate black threads emerging from her eye sockets, but I chalked that up to the sedation meds at the time. I don't remember much about the scan itself. I'm not sure how long I had been trapped in there for, but it was late morning when I went in, and pitch black outside when I came out. I had come to in that dark and tight space to the gentle whirring sound of the machine. There were no doctors, nurses, or technicians in my room, and the lights were off. It was eerily silent. I hadn't realized where I was at first, and had squirmed in my post-sedation stupor. I instinctively tried to sit up, and my nose made hard contact with the inside of the machine. They'd been kind enough to approve sedating me for the hour, and a half-long scan due to my claustrophobia. But then apparently they had just forgotten about me? I had pounded on the inside of that awful white tunnel, and screamed until I was hoarse. And still, no one came for me. At one point, I felt someone tug at me. Cold and clammy hands pulled indelicately at my ankles. But they must have given up, because not long afterwards, I was alone again. I would have thought the whole memory was a fabrication of my drugged mind, but there was a wet and dark residue on my ankles when I finally got out. I thought of Mary Ann sitting in the waiting room, and didn't know how everyone could have forgotten about me. Surely she would have asked about me when several hours had passed and I still hadn't returned. Eventually, I calmed down enough to release the belt and slowly inch my way out, trying to keep my eyes shut and my breathing steady, while not focusing on the fact that my face was so close to the inside of the tunnel that I could feel my own breath reflected back onto my face. I tried to ignore the friction burns, as I accidentally drug bare flesh against the smooth interior. In the distance, awful screaming like I had never heard before seamlessly transitioned into a laughter that was so odd it gave me chills. It floated down the silent hall. At one point, as I walked toward the elevator, I thought I saw small and perfectly round eyes gleaming at me from behind the glass panel in one of the darkened rooms. I told myself it was the last of the drugs in my system messing with my head. That was why the elevator buttons looked to be painted with still drying blood as they lit up too, I assured myself. Just the meds. I stumbled back the way that I remember the nurse leading me, until I saw something that made me stop cold. The handprints told a story, sloppily written in blood on what used to be an off-white floor. Pull, pull, drag. From following the uneven and messy tracks, I guess that someone had been hauling themselves down the hallway using their hands, while the rest of them dragged along the dingy linoleum, leaving streaky crimson in their wake. The hallway was littered with what looked like long, black hairs that seemed to be moving ever so slightly. At this point, I really hoped that I was just hallucinating. It began from the path to the waiting room, and then continued down the hall that forked away from me. There was so much blood. I didn't know how the person was even able to keep going that far. The smell was overwhelming. I'd accidentally stepped into it and could feel the still warm liquid as it seeped into my hospital-issued socks. I still couldn't blink both my eyes in unison. But those very real-feeling sensations, coupled with absolute lack of people and symphony of beeps and alerts from the other rooms on either side of the narrow hall, made it harder and harder to convince myself that I was simply drugged out of my mind. Somehow, despite all the other noise, I could still hear the faint, wet dragging sound of someone crawling through the darkness. I was a bit woozy and desperate to get out, so I called out into the distance that I was going to go get help. The sound of raw meat dragging along linoleum paused for a few moments before resuming. I realized that it seemed to grow louder, almost as if they had changed direction and were now heading back towards me. In that moment, I felt dread gnawing at me, and suddenly, I didn't want them to reach me. I felt that something terrible would happen if they did. After heading away from the increasingly loud, wet crawling sound in the hallway, I continued my trek back towards the waiting room. My moist socks left bloody footprints in my wake, the pattern which confirmed that I was still weaving a bit as I walked. If I were here alone, I probably would have hauled ass out the emergency exit door as soon as I saw the blood and whatever that was lurking in the darkness in the floor below. But I could see Marianne's lime green hatchback in the parking lot through a window in the hall. She was still inside. Even though the trail led from the waiting room, the person crawling through the empty hallway was not my wife, I told myself. She was fine. She'd still be sitting right where I'd seen her last. Some of the doors to the occupied rooms were just slightly ajar, and I tried to ignore the sounds coming from within them. I finally came across the nursing station that I had remembered being the last thing between myself and the secured doors. But what I saw there quickly killed any relief that had been forming. There were feet sticking out from just behind the counter. They moved and twitched irregularly. Despite my better judgment, I stepped over the mess of gore in the hallway to take a closer look. The legs seemed to dance to an unearthly melody that only their owner could hear. I saw my nurse, the one who had taken me back for the scan. I was so out of it before that I'd forgotten her name, but not her kind expression that matched the smiling faces on her trippy neon scrubs. That smile was long gone now. There was still a jagged bit of ribs and torso left above the hip bone and both legs, but the rest of her was just missing. I stared in horror, and it took me a moment for my eyes to adjust, and to see that the macabre dance was the result of something moving around just inside the gaping wound in what was left of her torso. I could see many of the now familiar, delicate, hair-like threads spilling out of her body. They moved in unison, and it almost looked as if the small tendrils were beginning to reform the parts of her body that were missing. It was like watching an otherworldly 3D printer for flesh and bone. I clamped a hand over my mouth tightly to keep quiet. and took a last, long, sad look at her blood-soaked scrubs and flailing legs. I sped up and continued onward clumsily. Despite what I told myself, I almost couldn't believe it when I found Marianne still sitting on the now sticky and saturated chair in the waiting room. Her sweater was slashed in places and stained. An entire arm of it was missing. Splatters and small droplets freckled her cheeks, and the cover of the book she was holding was now upside down. But she looked entirely uninjured. I had a fleeting moment where I wondered where the blood around her had come from, but was relieved more than anything else. The room was in disarray, and a single sneaker with the foot still in it peeked out from under her chair. But she didn't even seem remotely fazed by the carnage around her. She stared at me for a moment, almost as if she had to flip through mental flashcards before she recognized me. But I figured it was due to whatever horrible thing she had recently bore witness to. On our way out, I heard tapping behind the plastic panel at the check-in desk. I made the mistake of looking, and saw the young hospital employee from before, gripping the desk desperately, trying to stay upright. His face, which was devoid of any emotion, looked as misshapen as the rest of him, as if someone had tried to put together a human, having never seen one before. Those thin, black, tendril-like threads emerged from his eyes, and from the cavernous gap where his lower jaw should have been. They were weaving together, seamlessly blending into his skin before my eyes, repairing what likely should have been lethal injuries. We were so close to the exit when I heard the double doors move and duck behind some chairs. I tried to pull Marianne down with me, but she stood firm. Shoes, and the tattered and stained hems of brightly colored, smiley-faced scrubs came into view from where I was hidden. It seemed as if my poor nurse had simply gotten up and strolled away, unperturbed by the minor inconvenience that the entire top third of her body was missing. My wife stared, but didn't react at all to whatever she was witnessing. Eventually, what remained of my nurse walked out the front doors and disappeared into the darkness beyond the lights of the parking lot. We eventually made it to our car, but I can't drive yet, and she's just sitting in the driver's seat staring at me without blinking, still and quiet except for the occasional loud and irregular breath. I swear I see delicate threads spilling from under her eyes. I've called 911, but keep getting the dispatchers in the next county over. They keep routing me back to my own county, but no one is answering. I missed the moment when I thought waking up stuck in a full-body MRI was going to be the worst part of my day. My wife has been acting so weird since my MRI. We're still sitting here. I'm tired, confused, and have the worst itch forming behind my eyes. Hey everybody, hope you enjoyed today's first of 2 stories. I want to take a quick second to remind you to like, comment, and subscribe on this video. It really helps the channel grow and reach more new people. I was checking recently and saw that around half the people who watch the channel aren't yet subscribed, so I hope you'll take a quick second to hit that button if you haven't yet. Alright, now on to our next story. If I hadn't drunk an entire gallon of tea back at the hotel, maybe none of this would have happened. Well, maybe if we hadn't gotten kicked out of the hotel, none of this would have happened. It had been just the 2 of us in the small car, but with the animosity heavy in the air, it felt overcrowded. I don't know what had been worse. The hour of arguing, the 2 hours of silence afterwards, or the burgeoning realization that maybe I didn't know him as well as I thought I did. I studied him out of the corner of my eye. We'd been together for several months, but the recent experience left me wondering if I had ever even met the real Brian, who he truly was on the inside. It had been our very first trip together. We'd saved up for one of those super fancy hotels, and had been having a great time. Until, of course, Brian decided to attempt a 5-finger discount in the jewelry store in the lobby. He told me when we first started dating that he'd had some run-ins with the law in the past, when he was young, and that was the only way to put food on the table. And I understood. But this wasn't the same. It wasn't for survival. It was just greed. We both spent the rest of our vacation money, and then some, paying for that $1,800 watch so no charges would be pressed. They still kicked us out. I don't blame them. Asking him to stop at the next place we came across was the first thing I'd said to him in hours, and he nodded solemnly. My discomfort was escalating to the point where I was considering asking him to pull over to the side of the road, rain be damned, when we saw the dim sign flickering in the distance. The small store was out of place on the quiet, tree-lined mountain road. We'd been deep in a tunnel of trees, and hadn't seen so much as a hint of the lights in the distance. It seemed to just appear into view as we went around the bend. I didn't recall seeing it on the way to the hotel, so it was a pleasant surprise. I felt a flood of relief wash over me. It stuck out in the otherwise beautiful mountain landscape. Windows so dirty that the light inside barely reached us through them. Several letters on the sign lit up in such a way that the only word we could even see was a blood-red Mart flickering. Any relief I'd managed to feel was short-lived. When we walked in, we both froze as we took in the interior. I instantly wished we'd just stopped by the side of the road after all. I looked at Brian and could tell he felt it too. He was fiddling with his new watch and took off his glasses, cleaned them on his shirt, and put them back on, as if that would make what he was seeing make more sense. There were no other customers, no employees visible. It was just the two of us. Ceiling tiles hung askew, and the floor was filthy. We had to step over a drain in the floor with grimy stains circling it to walk in. If it weren't for the lights, the gentle hum of the AC, and grinding sounds floating down from the long hallway at the back, I'd have thought the place was abandoned. It was humid inside, and the smell coming from the old coolers that lined the back walls hit me as soon as we walked in. It reminded me of the summer my dad had decided to dabble in taxidermy in our basement. The slight hint of rot that lingered on the damp air indicated poorly done taxidermy at that. As I darted towards the back, towards the restroom sign, a placard dangling off it caught my eye, informing me that the restroom was for paying customers only. I quickly perused the shelves for something to buy. The aisles were tall, nearly to the ceiling, and despite the store being somewhat small, I felt the panicked sense of being cornered and trapped in an endless maze, at risk of becoming lost in there forever. The food on the shelves resembled nothing like the usual chips and candy these types of stores carried. There were rows upon rows of soft-looking mystery items in plastic wrap. Some of them leaked a red-brown residue down the shelves. None of it looked remotely appealing. I passed by a section with a stained placard that said, "Handcrafted from local artists," that was filled with eclectic items, none of which seemed to go together. There were torn shirts with random logos, nothing related to the town or the area we were in, stained with mud, grass, and God knows what else. Dried ropey things formed small and delicate sculptures of animals, unlike any I'd ever seen before. I reached for a bracelet with intricately carved white beads, but nearly dropped it when I realized the band was made up of woven human hair. It left a residue on my hand, and I noticed then that that same sour rot smell was coming from the collection of items, too. I opted for a flat and lukewarm Dr. Pepper instead, and placed two $2 coins on the glass counter in front of the hand-scrawled "Shoplifters will be processed" sign near the register. I figured I'd misread it. After all, it looked like it had been written by hand, unused to holding a pen. Brian had grabbed an armful of those unnerving plastic-wrapped packages, but hovered at the counter a bit too long. I could hear the scrape of him retrieving the coins on the glass, the sound of him dropping them into his pocket. He gave me a pointed stare as he did so. I sighed, so tired of arguing that I just walked away from him and down the hallway. I figured I'd pay again after he got back in the car. No sooner had I closed the door to the women's room behind me than I could hear him talking to someone. His voice rose until he was nearly yelling, mortified, and trying to delay being involved in another incident that day. I splashed water on my face while trying to drown out what appeared to be a one-sided argument. I kept trying to wash away that grimy feeling that had lingered on my hands after picking up the bracelet. But no matter how hard I scrubbed, I couldn't get it off. It kept getting worse. I felt nauseous when I realized the greasy residue was coming from the pale yellow bar of soap. I decided I'd scrub my hands raw at our next stop, and stepped out into the hall and back to the store. Brian wasn't there. I called out for him, but all I heard in answer was that same vague whirring and drilling sound coming from further down the long hallway. I doubled back to the car, but found it empty. I circled the store, my frustration turning to panic as I shouted his name and still got no response. I called his phone. It just rang and rang before going to voicemail. The car was locked, and he had the keys. I couldn't help but feel nervous, standing out there in the rain. We were still in the middle of the deep woods, and with clouds obscuring the light of the moon and stars, the area was blanketed in darkness. I reluctantly headed back inside. Somehow, the smell had managed to become even worse. I gagged when the wet, disgusting air hit my nose again. It was so strong I could nearly taste it, a putrid on my tongue. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone just behind me as I walked quickly through the tall aisles. But whenever I looked over my shoulder, there was never anything there. I called his phone, wondering how I'd managed to lose him in such a small store. When I finally heard it ringing, it was echoing from down that long hallway. As I headed towards it, I heard something moving on the other side of the floor-to-ceiling aisle, placing something onto the shelf with a sickening, wet thud before weaving lively through the aisles behind me. "Brian?" I called out softly, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, trying to disguise my fear. I knew it wasn't him. I don't know how, but I knew it. Have you ever had the feeling that if you look closely enough at something, if you truly see it, you'll never be able to close your eyes again without it haunting you? That feeling of being in close proximity to something that your fragile mind was never meant to know existed? I forced myself to turn around anyways. Once again, whoever or whatever had been there was gone by the time I rounded the aisle. But I heard a gentle clicking sound and saw a trail of red-pink droplets. I followed it back to that section, handcrafted from local artists, and there was something new hanging from a hook near the shelves. Wet, glistening strips dangled from along what looked to be a curved bone with bits of gristle still attached. From one of them hung an expensive men's wristwatch. Another was tied around a shattered, thick glasses lens. Yet another sagged under the weight of car keys. They swayed gently with the motion of having been recently placed. Fluid continued to drip from the still wet viscera and mingled with the mud on my shoes. Shoplifters will be processed. I didn't need to see the items down the other aisles to figure out what I was looking at. What must have happened. I could already tell that we'd never have another argument ever again. I heard a door open and close in the back. Soft footsteps approaching from down that hallway. I realized that, in my distraction, I'd forgotten to put money back on the counter. I choked up, but knew there was nothing I could do for him. So I tossed the first bills I found in my purse onto the floor, frantically untangled the car keys, and, in shock, I drove myself the remaining 4-hour drive home. Every so often, along the quiet country roads, those I could have sworn were empty on the drive up, I'd see that grimy building, the sign, Mart, flashing in the distance. I didn't stop once. I've been home for a week now. A few nights ago, something triggered a motion alert on my video doorbell, but there was no one there when I checked the footage. The next morning, I found a cardboard box on my porch, with no stamp or return address. In it was a worn t-shirt, and several of those now familiar wrapped packages, putrid fluid leaking out of them through the bottom of the soggy cardboard. I've received a similar box every night since. I don't know if it's meant as a threat, or if due to some sort of twisted interpretation, I'm now a paying customer. He's slowly being returned to me. Either way, it turns out that I've gotten to see who Brian was on the inside after all.
Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/JordanGroupHorror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.